What is it about the future that is so captivating? To know more, to know what would happen beforehand, so as to prepare for it, to change it. Does it remain the future, the realm of potential and unknown possibility, if you can divert it? Namaskaram, listeners. Nishta Jeeva here. And tonight we have in our story an investigator who travels to the land of palm reading, horoscopes, Jyotishi to use the Hindi word for it, in search of a fascinating individual, but uncovers a darkness that has power over the future and thus people's fragile lives. So, sit back, put on your headphones, and listen as you tap into that future that will be me reading this story. Our author, the real Dr. Margin, brings to you The Prophetess.
My name is Dr. Michael Margin. If there is anything I have learned from my explorations, anything at all, it is that evil does not rest. It does not sleep. Instead, it rises, it evolves, it creates. Take the vampire, for example. When the late Dr. Stoker popularized his findings on the demon, it was a veritable terror to all. We even heard a whisper of the name. And who could blame them? Here is an irresistible predator with an irresistible thirst for human blood, charged not only with the powers of appearance and charisma, but also that of black magic. It's horrible, gruesome, the things of nightmares, if nightmares truly focus on the terror of our plane instead of our own anxieties. And what happened to the vampire? It, like a house dog, was domesticated. It was taught tricks that it never had the capacity to learn, told to sit, to stand, to love, and it obeyed. The vampire no longer elicits goosebumps of terror, but instead those of teenage puberty. And because of this, because of their massive image change, one can barely find a vampire who causes any fear at all. But where does that leave me? I began my journey to seek out the horrific, the damned, and the cursed. And wherever I turned, I saw nothing but the domesticated citizens of our modern world. It wasn't until I was at the end of my rope, eating a particularly boring vegetarian dinner with a werewolf in India, that I discovered that there was still hope for the terrible. He had just finished speaking about how Hindu ideas could influence the reincarnation as a monster, and he could tell he was losing me. So he cleared his throat and began anew. "You do know," said the lycanthrope, sipping a glass of lassi. "There are others." "Others?" I asked. "Other creatures, monsters, new monsters." "Really?" I sat forward, all intent now. "What kind of monsters?" "The forces of evil do not simply halt, Doctor. When one species of monster die out," he took a breadcrumb and, crumbling it between his fingers, scattered it on the tablecloth. "Another are born." He blew quickly, scattering the remains. I was intrigued by this idea, so much so, I decided to abandon my last research project for this new one. The monsters of yesterday were where I begun. They may be on their way out, soon to be just civilians diagnosed with some condition or the other, but they hear rumors of the monsters of tomorrow. They would shudder themselves when describing the next race, and I was able, piece by piece, to create a framework for these new monsters. That's when the real work began. Following the trail around the world, I was able to create a guide of these new monsters and their mythology, and hence, my journal. I cannot promise you that you will not find offense in any of these pages of this journal. All I can tell you is that every single facet of it is 100% researched and scientific. So, peruse, examine, investigate, and enjoy with me as I begin Dr. Margin's Guide to New Monsters. In today's entry, which Karan was kind enough to place in the show, I bring to you entry 7, The Prophetess. Nothing is promised to us, not even the future. This, however, hasn't stopped people from trying to promise it. And not just the future, but the future. Fortune tellers, psychics, and astrologers all existed before a system of measuring time was even fully in place. Because if one can tell what time will bring, do they need to understand it at all? Precognition is a tricky subject within my field. There are some who believe that an individual can predict the future and do so accurately simply because they have an innate ability or talent. Others claim the ability does not exist at all. Still, others say that it is necessary to have some sort of guide to have this ability, a non human conduit to gain the skill. I usually consider myself part of this third party. And my recent travels to India did nothing but affirm this belief. One round trip ticket, a taxi for one, a room at an inn for one, and I was there. There was Mandwa in the Junjunu district of India, a town that enjoys a bit of respite from the overpopulation of the surrounding cities. The people are traditional, probably more so than anything else. The center of the town has claim to its market, and each day, merchants and tea brewers and shoppers populate its streets, only to pack up each night and make their way there the next morning. But I was not interested in any of their wares or services. I was interested in one woman. They called her the Prophetess. She sits on a mat in the corner of the market, and yet she is the most popular vendor there. Men and women travel far and wide to hear her predictions. Some walk away with nothing but their money back. That aura was off. She was unable to read them, come again later. But the others walk away with predictions. Predictions that claimed total accuracy. I met with the prophetess late, her last customer. She sat, cross-legged, and looked up at me. Her head was shaved completely, save for a single thick braid that extended from her scalp and hung by her face. Her eyes searched me quizzically. I did not look like a regular customer, but she was professional nonetheless. Sit, sir, sit. Hear what will come to pass. Hear knowledge before knowledge arrives. It was a classic pitch. You could hear the sit, sir, sit. Hear what will come to pass. Hear knowledge before knowledge arrives. Classic pitch. You could hear the rehearsal in her voice. I sat down and she examined me closer. Amriki? She asked, going off script. I nodded. It was no difficult distinction to make. And you wish to know the future? Actually, I responded, I was more interested in your past. She tugged at her braid at this request. My past? Why? What is done is inconsequential to what would be. She was right back on script again. I'm a researcher from America. I would like to hear how you got to where you are. I'm willing to pay, double even, for the trouble of it all. I held out the money. I needed to explain no more. The almighty dollar is a better convincer than I ever was. She reached out and took it. Satisfied, she placed it in her shawl and began to speak again. I'm glad to take your money, sir, but I'm afraid there's not much to tell. Begin with your family life, if you would. Are you married? The prophetess touched her head, not her braid this time, but the skin surrounding it. I was, she said, but no longer. What happened? He died. She did not want to speak of it any longer, but I needed more than that. How did he die? He fell ill. We were married for years, many years. We had 2 sons together. And are they still living? Yes, she said, surprised. Yes, of course. And then, not without a bit of pride in her voice, they live with me. I provide for them. But your husband? Yes, one day he leaves for business. Says he needs to go to a couple of towns over. Will be back in a few days. But when he does return, he was sick, very sick. He hardly seemed the same man. His hair was in tassels. His beard was in clumped braids. And he had a wild fever, hallucinations. I tried to take care of him, but it got difficult. He would become violent, threaten me and the children. He was paranoid, mad. One morning, I'm making his bed and I found a knife under his pillow. It was then I knew the children were in danger. And what did you do? I moved my children out. They stayed with their grandmother. I looked after him, tough. I tried to nurse him back to health, but it did nothing. He passed, and I caught in the sickness soon after. But you survived. Hardly. The disease ravaged me, but it was the men afterwards that almost killed me. What men? Of the town. They claimed I had taken my husband's children from him, that I had let him die. They took me to the street and beat me, shaved my head. I'm a disgraced woman. She toyed with the remaining braid. They shaved it all, but this. She tugged on it again. Why did they leave it? They could not cut it. Nothing could tear it, regardless of what they used. They changed from violent to frightened. They left me to die on the street. She looked up at me and smiled. But again, I survived. And was that when you started to prophesy? Yes, it started oddly enough. I would hear predictions in my head, whispered and monotone, about those I passed on the street. It went on until I couldn't stand it anymore. I began to tell people as I passed them, people I've never even met before. And when they started coming true, of course, more started to come. I began to charge them to provide for my family, and that brings us to where we are. And are you able to tell all people? She shook her head, tugging on her braid again. No, she said. Sometimes I hear it, sometimes I don't. Sometimes a customer goes and comes back, and I'm suddenly able. What about your children? Have you ever tried it with them? Oh, yes, plenty of times. But there was never a prediction, not yet anyway. There was a pause. I hear it for you. Would you like to know? The future is tempting, but I knew better. No, I said instantly. No, thank you. I think I've got enough for tonight. Thank you. She nodded at me as I stood, telling her I would try and visit her again the next night. Later that night, there was an uproar. When I moved out of my room to see what was the matter, I saw that the men of the town had dragged her out of her home and tied her to a pole in the middle of the square. I moved out as quickly as I could, trying to ascertain what was happening, what she was being punished for. After some time of trying to converse with some very angry men in broken English, I finally got the story. The prophetess had smothered both her children in their sleep. I was able to get to her, somehow, through the crowd. Her eyes shined with hope when she saw me, and she grasped me by the hands tight. Please, help me. You need to help me. They're going to kill me. She held my hands to her face and pleaded with me. They're saying you killed them. They're saying you smothered your children. She didn't respond, but continued to weep in my hands. I pulled them back slowly and looked at her. Did you do it? I asked quietly. She got silent, looked up at me, and nodded. I went into their rooms tonight after they'd fallen asleep. There they were, my two perfect angels, sleeping peacefully in their beds. And then I heard it. Heard what? Their futures, what they were going to do, how they would be, what they would suffer in their lives. And I had to. I did them a favor. A mercy, sir, a mercy. But you killed them. Don't you see that? Your own children, you killed them. She pursed her lips together, stopped crying, and looked down at the floor instead. What is done is inconsequential to what would be. It was the last thing she said. They took her, the mob, and placed her on a pyre, screaming that she was a devil, and burning her alive. Tradition, after all. I stood by the pyre until it was over, until the flames died down, until there was nothing but ashes and a charred skeleton. A skeleton with the braid attached. There was a hissing sound, and the braid wiggled once, twice, Then it got erect, distangled itself. Spindly legs grew silently from it, sides lifting it from the ground. Its hundreds of legs moved, skittering forward, back, and then forward again towards me. The prophetess, then, was not the woman herself, but the creature before me. The creature is symbiotic. It has a mutually beneficial relationship with its host, or rather, with those who survive its bonding process. It lives by attaching itself to a host, but gives them its own ability, a foretelling of the future. The prophetess moved its head up at me, a million tiny teeth in a spiral lining its throat. A voice spoke then, in my head. It was as if my own thoughts had been hijacked, and a foreign one was directing them to form words that didn't originate with me. It was like the passing thoughts as one falls asleep, but more directed to form one sentence into another. Michael Margin, I can tell you things only you would know. It took a couple of its spindly steps towards me. The woman, Michael Margin. You must be wary of her. I pride myself on being a researcher. I do nothing but investigate these creatures, take notes of them, and leave them as they are. I am no monster hunter, but here, staring into the gaping mouth of this monster, the creature may have been able to foresee the future, a power nothing should have. But it did not foresee me lifting myself and crushing it under my foot. It hissed like it was deflating, and then there was nothing but silence. Perhaps it was just the quiet of town that was long from waking, but to me, it was the golden silence of an unknown future. I left soon thereafter to see what new and terrible things I could find.